Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Get ready for another incredible story. I never thought I'd be sitting here, staring out my window with a cup of tea in my hands, remembering that night like it was yesterday. But some moments in life carve themselves so deeply into your memory that no matter how much time passes, they remain just as vivid, just as full of emotion. I was 62 years old, long past the age of chasing excitement or expecting surprises. At this stage in life, you think you've seen it all, especially when you've worked at the same company for nearly 20 years. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I was the executive assistant to Daniel Carter, the CEO of a well-known publishing house in Chicago. He was the kind of boss people respected, not because he demanded it, but because he carried himself with quiet authority. He was always professional, always in control, and never once had he blurred the lines between business and personal matters. Until that night. It started with a simple email. "Dinner tonight, my treat. I have something important to discuss with you." I frowned at my screen, rereading the message a few times. Daniel never asked me to dinner. Yes, we worked late often, and sometimes ordered food to the office. But this was different. This was an invitation. My first instinct was to decline. After all, what could possibly be so important that it couldn't be discussed in the office? But curiosity got the better of me, and before I could overthink it, my fingers were already typing back, "Sure, what time and where?" His response came almost instantly. 7 p.m. La Bellevue? I blinked. La Bellevue wasn't just any restaurant. It was one of the most elegant, intimate places in the city. Candlelit tables, a pianist in the corner playing soft jazz, and a menu so exclusive you had to book weeks in advance. A strange, nervous energy settled in my stomach as I packed up my things that evening. Was this about work? A promotion? No, that didn't make sense. I was already at the top of my role, maybe a retirement offer, but then why dinner at a place like that? By the time I arrived at the restaurant, my heart was pounding harder than it should have been for a simple dinner. The hostess led me to a secluded table near the window where Daniel was already waiting. He stood as I approached, his usual crisp suit in place, but there was something different about him, an almost restless energy in the way he straightened his cufflinks and smoothed his tie. "You look lovely tonight," he said, as I took my seat. I laughed lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Thank you. I hope this isn't about my quarterly reports, because I was really hoping for a night off from spreadsheets." He chuckled, but there was a warmth in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. "No, it's not about work, at least not entirely." The waiter arrived with wine, and before I could say a word, Daniel had already ordered a bottle of my favorite, Chateau Margaux. My stomach flipped. How did he know that? The conversation started off light, filled with easy laughter and stories about the office. But as the night went on, I began to feel something shift in the air between us, a tension I couldn't quite place. Finally, after the plates were cleared, he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. "I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to feel pressured." "I want your honest answer." I held my breath, nodding. "I'm retiring at the end of the year." My heart sank. I had worked alongside Daniel for 2 decades. He was more than my boss, he was my friend. The idea of him leaving left a strange hollow in my chest. "But that's not why I asked you here," he continued, studying me carefully. "I've spent the last few years thinking about what life will look like after I step down. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that there's someone I don't want to leave behind when I walk away from that office." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Daniel." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "I don't just admire you, Evelyn. I care about you more than I probably should. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. I never said anything before, because I never wanted to cross that line. But now, as I look at the years ahead, I realize I don't want them to be without you. My mind spun. This was my boss, my stable, professional, never out-of-line boss, and he was sitting across from me, telling me that he cared for me. I know this is unexpected, he continued, squeezing my hand gently. And I know you probably never saw me that way, but I had to tell you, because if there's even a small chance that you might feel the same way, then maybe we don't have to keep pretending this is just a professional relationship. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I was 62 years old. Romance wasn't something I had considered for a long time. After my divorce, I had buried myself in work, convinced that those parts of life were behind me. And yet, sitting here, looking into the eyes of a man who had been by my side for 20 years, I realized something. I wasn't just shocked, I wasn't just flattered, I was afraid, because deep down, in a place I hadn't let myself explore, I knew he wasn't the only one who had been pretending all these years. I stared at Daniel, my heart pounding in my chest. The world around us seemed to shrink. No clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, just the weight of his words pressing down on me. I care about you more than I probably should. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching under his touch. How was I supposed to respond to something like this? Daniel, I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. You don't have to say anything right now, he said gently, his eyes filled with understanding. Evelyn, I've waited too long to tell you this, and I don't want to waste any more time. Time. That word sat heavily between us. At 62, I wasn't a woman who daydreamed about grand romances or whirlwind affairs. My life had settled into a rhythm, predictable, steady, safe. And now, in the middle of an elegant restaurant, the man I had worked beside for 2 decades was asking me to consider something that could change everything. I pulled my hand back, needing space to think. Daniel, I never thought about you that way. I mean, you've always been my boss, my friend. I know, he said, with a small, almost sad smile. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I should have let you see me as more than that a long time ago. I sighed, reaching for my wine glass just to have something to do with my hands. You caught me off guard. This is a lot to take in. I understand, he nodded, not pushing, not demanding, just waiting. But tell me one thing, Evelyn. When you think about your life outside of work, do you ever think about yourself, about what you want, or have you just accepted that this is it? His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. When was the last time I had thought about my own happiness, my own desires? My marriage had ended over 15 years ago, not in some dramatic betrayal, but in a slow, quiet drifting apart. My ex-husband had remarried within 2 years, while I had buried myself in work, telling myself I was fine, that I didn't need anything more than what I had. And now, for the first time in years, someone was asking me what I wanted. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying me. Then maybe it's time to find out. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. And what if I find out I'm not ready for this? What if I just can't? His lips curved into a knowing smile. Then I'll accept that. But something tells me that's not what you're going to find. The waiter arrived with the check, and Daniel took care of it before I even had the chance to reach for my purse. As we stood to leave, he placed a hand on the small of my back, light, warm, steady. It sent an unexpected shiver through me. "I don't want an answer tonight," he said softly as we stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air. "I just want you to think about it." I nodded, still feeling like I was walking in a daze. "I will," he smiled, his gaze holding mine for a second longer than necessary. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Daniel." That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of dinner. The way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, the way my own body had betrayed me. My pulse had quickened when he touched my hand. I had leaned in just a little closer without even realizing it. Had I truly never thought about him in that way, or had I just buried it so deep that I refused to acknowledge it? The next morning, I arrived at the office early, hoping for a moment to collect myself before facing him. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew that wouldn't be possible. A single red rose sat on my desk, its petals still fresh with morning dew. No note, no explanation, just a silent message waiting for me to respond. The rose sat there, delicate yet impossible to ignore. My fingers hovered over its petals, but I didn't touch it. I knew who had left it. I didn't need a note to tell me. I inhaled sharply, setting my bag down and taking my seat. My office felt different that morning, charged with something I couldn't quite name. The routine that had always been my comfort suddenly felt unsteady beneath my feet. "Daniel," his words from the night before replayed in my head. "Do you ever think about yourself? About what you want?" I had spent so many years convinced that I didn't need anything more than what I had, my independence, my career, my carefully built solitude. And yet here I was, staring at a single rose and feeling something stir inside me. I was still lost in thought when I heard a familiar knock at my office door. "Morning." His voice was warm, steady. I turned, and there he was. Daniel, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Morning," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Did you get my gift?" My gaze flickered back to the rose. "I did." He tilted his head slightly, watching me carefully. I let out a slow breath, folding my hands in my lap. "And I don't know what you expect me to say, Daniel." He gave a small smile, moving to sit across from me. "I don't expect anything, Evelyn. I just want to know what's going through your mind." I hesitated. "Honestly? I feel like my whole world tilted last night. For 20 years, I've seen you as my boss, my friend, and suddenly you're asking me to see you differently." He nodded, his gaze steady. "Is that such a bad thing?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Evelyn. That's the last thing I'd ever want. But I can't pretend I don't feel this way." "Not anymore." I swallowed hard. "And what exactly is this, Daniel? What are you even asking me for?" His expression softened. "A chance. A chance for you to see if maybe there's something here. If maybe, just maybe, you could feel the same way." I looked away, staring out the window at the city below. The skyline stretched out before me, familiar, yet suddenly full of possibilities I had never considered. Could I really do this? Could I take the risk? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can just change how I see you." Daniel didn't look disappointed. If anything, he looked patient, understanding. "Then don't force it. Let it happen naturally." I turned back to him, my fingers twisting together. And if it doesn't, he smiled, a real, genuine smile, then I'll still be here, no matter what. I exhaled, feeling some of the weight in my chest loosen. That's a dangerous promise, Daniel. His eyes twinkled. I'm willing to take my chances. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. I had expected things to be awkward, tense, but they weren't. If anything, Daniel carried on as if nothing had changed. He didn't push, he didn't hover, and yet I felt it. Every time he passed by my office, every time our eyes met across the conference table, every time his voice softened just a little when he said my name, by the time the day ended, I was exhausted, not from work, but from my own thoughts. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a message. Daniel, dinner, just dinner, no pressure, what do you say? I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could say no. I could keep things exactly as they were, safe, predictable, or I could take a step into the unknown. My heart pounded as I typed my response. Me, where and what time? The restaurant was quiet, dimly lit, with the soft hum of conversation filling the air. I sat at the table, fingers wrapped around the stem of my wine glass, watching the candlelight flicker. Daniel sat across from me, relaxed, his gaze steady, as always. If he was nervous, he didn't show it, but I was. I had spent the entire day trying to talk myself out of coming. And yet here I was, sitting across from the man who had been my boss for 2 decades, now seeing him in a way I never had before. Thank you for saying yes, Daniel said, his voice warm. I smiled faintly. I almost didn't. He chuckled. I figured. I let out a breath, shifting in my seat. I don't know what to do with this, Daniel. I don't know how to suddenly start seeing you differently. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. I'm not asking you to. I just wanted tonight to be easy. Just 2 people having dinner. I studied him. He made it sound so simple. But nothing about this felt simple to me, and yet, as the night went on, I found myself relaxing. We talked about work, about old stories from the past, about silly things that made me laugh, and it felt natural. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching me closely. I missed this, he said. I arched a brow. Missed what? Seeing you like this. You're always so serious at work, always taking care of everything and everyone. But here, right now, you're just you, I blinked, caught off guard by his words. I wasn't sure the last time someone had looked at me like that. Really looked at me. The thought sent a flutter through my chest, something unfamiliar and unexpected. After dinner, we walked outside, the cool night air wrapping around us. I was about to call a cab when Daniel spoke. Let me drive you home. I hesitated. It felt like a line I shouldn't cross, but after a moment, I nodded. The drive was quiet, comfortable. My thoughts swirled as we pulled up to my house. When he put the car in park, I turned to him, searching for the right words. Daniel, He reached over, gently taking my hand. His touch was warm, steady. You don't have to say anything, Evelyn. I swallowed. But I do. I don't know where this goes. I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for. His thumb brushed lightly over my fingers. Then let's not rush. Let's just take it one step at a time. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding. You make it sound so easy, he smiled. Because it should be, I looked at him then. Really looked at him, and for the first time I let myself wonder, what if? Maybe this wasn't the ending of something. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. I squeezed his hand lightly before pulling away, reaching for the door handle. "Good night, Daniel." He watched me with that same steady patience. "Good night."
Evelyn. As I stepped out and walked toward my front door, I could still feel the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something else too. Hope.